Thank you so much. Let me first of all start with thanks for this commendable initiative. And I know, Martina, that it's not been very easy to put all this together. And next, many thanks to Professor Cui for a very comprehensive presentation of the Chinese perspective, certainly informative and very useful for the sake of understanding. And I'm saying this because I see this discussion as a perfect opportunity for us to map out certain areas where the EU and China can either find common ground or agree to disagree. But in either case, clarity will be beneficial. Understanding each other's position can only be beneficial. And I think this is the beauty of intellectual exchange. In fact, I think that Professor Cui and myself are privileged, to speak openly and frankly. And we have the privilege, to say things that politicians may not be in a position, to discuss so openly. Another remark, I understand that the initial idea was that we should discuss EU-China relations in light of Biden's election. My presentation is geared mostly in that direction towards this topic. So if we can quickly move on to the next slide, please. I thought that I should start out by saying what Europeans expect now that Biden is the president-elect and he's expected to take over on the 20th of January. I would highlight four key expectations. First of all, comparing Biden's likely presidency, the likely policies of Joe Biden, comparing his likely policies to Donald Trump's, it's clear that Trump made surprise a key dimension of his China policy. It's quite clear that on many occasions he tried to take China off guard. Conversely, Biden's administration is expected to be more consistent and more predictable. It is also expected, at least this is what Europeans expect, Biden's policies, China policy, is likely to be more sophisticated and multidimensional, based on a wider range of tools. It is expected to have simultaneously elements of containment and selective decoupling on the one hand. There will be a focus on human rights and the rule of law, but on the other hand, it is likely that Biden's China policy will also contain a strong element of cooperation, for instance, on combating COVID-19, climate change, of course, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. In other words, Europeans expect Biden's China policy to move closer to the EU's complex definition of China as a partner, competitor, and strategic or systemic rival at the same time. Professor Cui quite rightly highlighted this. This is indeed the EU's definition of China. The second expectation is that Europeans see Joe Biden as a long-standing supporter of strong transatlantic relations. It is assumed that his foreign policy positions will align with some mainstream European views on many issues. It is assumed that a Biden administration is likely to reaffirm US support for NATO. Of course, it is expected that Biden will bring the United States back to the Paris Climate Change Agreement. He is expected to help resolve some trade disputes between Europe and the United States. He's expected to reverse Trump's decision to withdraw the United States from the World Health Organization, perhaps engage with Russia on negotiations for a New START treaty, and perhaps Biden will bring the United States back to the table, to the negotiating table, on a negotiated solution to the Iranian nuclear issue. At the same time, Europeans expect Joe Biden to face two formidable challenges. The first challenge is that his utmost priority at the very beginning will be combating COVID-19 in the United States itself, and of course the economic fallout. It's quite clear that the United States is facing a huge economic problem. Of course, Biden has spoken about his immediate measures over the first 100 days in office. He has spoken about reshoring critical value chains back to the United States, including those for drugs and medical equipment. But I still think that it may take a while before we can see a coherent China policy emerging, and the real impact of Joe Biden's presidency on the global scene may take a few months at least. And the second big challenge that Joe Biden is likely to face is, of course, the very mandate that he will have. We have to see just how strong his mandate will be, because America is deeply split. We know that. Let's see whether the Republicans will retain control over the Senate. This will largely depend on the by-elections to be held in the state of Georgia next month, because if Republicans do retain control over the Senate, this will not make Joe Biden's life any easier. In fact, with a Republican-controlled Senate, he will find it much more difficult to bring the United States back to the Paris Climate Agreement. He will find it much more difficult, to promote expenditure and regulatory measures necessary to decarbonize America's economy. And of course, it'll be difficult for him to bring the United States back to the negotiating table on Iran. Ironically, the difficulties and the rift between Europe and America is not that much a transatlantic issue. It seems to relate to divergences and differences between Republicans and Democrats within the United States itself, which is why Europeans keep a close eye on a very watchful eye on developments within the United States itself. Now, with relation to EU-China relations, let me tell you this. I've tried to have first of all, a look at the transatlantic bond and then see how this translates into EU-China relations. I've identified 4 key areas where EU-China relations are likely, where EU-China relations are likely to be affected by Biden's election. Trade and investment, let's say that's the economy. Climate change, that's fairly explicit. The third area is international balance of power and security. Let's say that this is a euphemism for geopolitics. And the fourth key area is governance. Once again, let's say that this is a euphemism for systemic features, because we have different systems of governance. Regarding the trade and investment area, you know that the United States and Europe have always had their own trade spats, if not trade wars. They've certainly had trade spats, and they peaked under Trump. Let me remind you that when Trump came to power, one of his first moves in the Oval Office was to cancel the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. Under Biden, Europeans expect less tense US-EU relations. In fact, when it comes to China, you know that the United States and Europeans share a number of concerns. Again, let me remind you that back in 2016, both the US and the EU denied China a market economy status. You know that both the US and the EU have been demanding better market access in China. Both take issue with intellectual property rights, with forced technology transfers. Both Americans and Europeans are sensitive about takeovers of key infrastructure and high technology by Chinese companies. On the receiving end, you know that the United States has its Committee on Foreign Investments, CFIUS, while the EU has recently adopted its FDI screening mechanism regulation, which of course affects the presence of Chinese companies in the EU. And of course, there's the 5G issue. There's no hiding that the Americans have put a lot of pressure on the Europeans. You know, the catchphrase is high-risk vendors, which is a clear reference to Huawei and the ZTE. And there's been a wave of skepticism sweeping across Europe. I think the United Kingdom is a case in point. You can see their turnaround on the 5G issue and their relations with the relations between the UK and China have really deteriorated over the past 6 months or so. Interestingly, the European Commission is considering a proposal that Europe is likely to submit to the Americans for the creation of a Trade and Technology Council, TTC. It is likely that Europeans and Americans will discuss some sort of closer coordination on trade and technology. Now, how does that translate in the area of EU-China relations and their economic cooperation? I think it's quite clear that China will remain a large market for European companies and exports. And of course, Europe remains a large market for Chinese companies. I'm taking note of Professor Cue's forecast that ASEAN may become China's biggest trade partner. That's certainly a very interesting development, but there's no doubt that Europe will remain a key trade partner for China, and Chinese companies are, of course, very much interested in enhancing their presence in Europe. Now, we have to watch progress on the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, or the Bilateral Investment Treaty, as the Chinese side prefers to refer to it. After 7 years of negotiations, it's no secret that there's a lot of frustration in Europe. On the European side, Europeans would like to see the CAI or BIT concluded as soon as possible. Interestingly, this rapprochement between the EU and the United States is likely, in my view, to lead to a harder EU position on key provisions of the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. Again, I took note of the key issues that Professor Cue referred to: labor safety, environmental protection. These are indeed some of the issues. I think it's a fairly long list of contentious issues. My feeling is that the EU position may actually become harder now that the transatlantic bond is likely to be reaffirmed. There are issues between the EU and China when it comes to the Belt and Road. I'm sure you're fairly aware of the fact that back in 2018, 27 European ambassadors to China signed a letter criticizing the Belt and Road Initiative, the way it is being managed and implemented. they basically made a point that European companies do not have easy access to BRI projects financed by Chinese policy banks. And this issue has been there for quite a while, I would say. We have to admit, and this is no secret, that the image of the Belt and Road has become quite controversial in Europe. It has taken a negative turn. Chinese investment in Europe under the label of the Belt and Road Initiative has actually come down. So economic cooperation between the EU and China has its ups and downs, it has its pros and cons. It is not free of disputes and controversy. Let me go to the second area, which is climate change. I think that if Joe Biden indeed takes the United States back to the Paris Accord, this will be a major development of historic proportions that will bring a new momentum to what is a much needed global consensus on this existential threat that needs to be addressed by everybody, including China, Europe and the United States. That will be a largely positive, definitely a very positive development. Now, how will this impact EU-China relations? We are all aware of the fact that President Xi recently announced China's commitment to carbon neutrality by 2060 at the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. This is largely positive because it is the first time that China commits itself to a specific timetable, and there are some milestones. For instance, China announces that, of course, carbon dioxide emissions will peak in 2030 and they will start coming down afterwards towards 2060. The so-called intended nationally determined contributions will be a specific milestone to keep an eye on. Again, this is seen as being largely positive, but the European side remains cautious because this is just a goal. It's not a given. We have 40 years to go to reach 2060. And what is certain at present is that China's greenhouse gas emissions will keep rising for at least another decade. And this does not sound quite reassuring to many Europeans because it does not seem to demonstrate a sense of urgency about combating climate change. Yet another concern about climate change on the part of Europeans relates to, again, the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative. It is acknowledged that Chinese authorities are trying to address domestic pollution within China itself. And in fact, China does have a lot of achievements internally, domestically. At the same time, China's Rust Belt industry has been busy along Belt and Road routes. A number of coal-fired power plants are being built by Chinese companies in Asia, Africa, and Southeastern Europe. In reality, while Chinese authorities are aiming to improve the situation at home, China is exporting carbon-intensive economic activities abroad. And in this way, China is placing the burden of CO2 emissions on other countries' shoulders. Now, at the second Belt and Road Forum in April 2019, President Xi spoke about an open, green and clean BRI. It is widely seen that Beijing's new rhetoric is an acknowledgement of controversies surrounding many China-funded infrastructure projects under the BRI. And many European scholars, environmentalists, and politicians are of the view that China now needs to prove in practice that it is as good as its word. Let me move on to the third area, international balance of power and security, which is basically about geopolitics. Now, the EU and the United States have always been, partners within the framework of NATO. NATO has become controversial in many ways. There's no hiding it, and the Chinese scholars know very well that there have been heated disputes within NATO. You know that the Americans have always put pressure on the Europeans to increase their defense expenditure. You know very well that the French President Macron has called NATO brain dead. Obviously, NATO has discussions within NATO between Americans and Europeans have not always been amicable. What do Europeans expect from Joe Biden? They expect that relations will become less tense. They expect Joe Biden to restore channels of communication between Europe and America. And of course, they expect Biden's administration to turn to America's traditional allies. There are indications that Biden and European diplomats have started to negotiate a grand bargain between the two partners, between Europe and America. And of course, Europeans expect, in terms of geopolitics, they expect America to re-engage itself in international organizations, all the UN agencies, the WHO, the United Nations Human Rights Council. Of course, this will help America claim again its leading role in a number of areas. How can this impact EU-China relations? It is more or less given in Europe that China will remain a systemic rival. If you look at NATO, there was recently a report released by the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission. It's a Congress body, and it speaks about China as a threat to the current international order. This will obviously affect European thinking as well. Within NATO, a recent study drafted by NATO experts, and let me quote this: NATO must devote much more time, political resources and action to the security challenges posed by China, based on an assessment of its national capabilities, economic heft, and the stated ideological goals of its leaders. This is something to be kept in mind. I mean, and I'm sure that Chinese scholars know this quite well. There's also this shift towards having an Indo-Pacific strategy, and again, Professor Cui rightly highlighted this. Yes, Germany and recently the Netherlands have released their Indo-Pacific strategies. There's clearly, this is clearly a development to be kept in mind. I would say that when it comes to geopolitics, conflict resolution, there's plenty of room for cooperation with China. For instance, when it comes to North Korea, I cannot think of any solution to that problem without China's involvement. I mean, that's quite clear, and it should be acknowledged. If we think of Afghanistan, I think that it's high time that China, in fact, contributed to the peace process in Afghanistan. We must very frankly admit that the United States and Europe as well have not been successful in settling the Afghanistan conflict. So I would very much like to hear Professor Cui's opinion on whether China could and how exactly China could contribute to the conflict in Afghanistan. Mind you, it's very close to my heart. I've served in Afghanistan for 2 years. So I'd like very much to engage Professor Cui on this. And let me also say that in terms of geopolitics, I fully agree. And Europeans do not want yet another Cold War. In fact, they would prefer a multilateral world order instead of a bipolar world. Let me move on to the next area because I suspect that we are short of time. When it comes to governance, yes, it is true that Mr. Borrell has spoken about a common DNA of Europeans and Americans when it comes to our core values and our common system of governance called parliamentary democracy. This is an indisputable fact that Europeans and Americans share very many systemic features. Back in the second half of the 18th century, when the United States emerged on the map, it was populated mostly by Europeans who claimed their independence from Great Britain, right? It is true that over the past 2 centuries and a half, American society has become a lot more diverse, a lot more multi-ethnic and multiracial. But I would say that its political genes have always remained very close to Europe. After the end of the Second World War, the United States provided a security umbrella to Western Europe on the basis of these shared core values and a common governance system. Ultimately, this system prevailed in Europe and now includes the majority of East European states as well. It is true that Donald Trump did not care a lot about these values, but it is assumed in Europe that Joe Biden does. And his administration is expected to uphold these shared values again. Having said that, it is also true that at present transatlantic relations are not what they used to be. They are marked by disagreement on a number of issues. Trump's presidency revealed obvious cracks and rifts in the traditional bond between Americans and Europeans. There's no hiding it. It is equally true that the United States and the EU remain much closer to each other than the EU can ever be to China. I mean, the distance between Europe and America is much shorter than it can ever be between Europe and China. This is a fact to be kept in mind. Now, how does that translate on in relations between the EU and China in terms of governance and systemic features? Again, Professor Cui rightly referred to Xinjiang, Hong Kong. Yes, I think that Europeans, the position of the EU on these issues will remain hard. I think I expect sustained tension between the EU and China on issues that relate to human rights and democracy. In fact, I'm sure that you are aware of this discussion between Europeans and Americans and Biden's idea that maybe there should be a D10 club, Democracy 10 club, or an international forum, an international conference, I don't know yet, which should bring together countries around the world with this democratic system of governance. Let me pick a point from Professor Cui's presentation on the battle of narratives, which was indeed referred to by Mr. Borrell. Yes, it started out amid the pandemic and what became known as China's mask diplomacy in Europe. Let me simply add that it's not only Mr. Borrell, but other key European officials have spoken about this. They've spoken about China's mask diplomacy and the battle of narratives. The President of the European Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen, the German Chancellor Merkel herself, they've spoken about China's mask diplomacy in Europe. And it's also a fact that needs to be acknowledged and taken into account that China's image in Europe has deteriorated over the past year or so. I mean, this is what comes out of a number of surveys. Let me move on to the conclusions. Let me draw two main conclusions at this stage. I would say that the common ground between the United States and the EU is highly likely to expand under Biden's administration. And this will no doubt affect EU-China relations as well. The second conclusion is that the EU is rejecting a binary choice between Beijing and Washington. The EU is not happy with the prospect of a bipolar world. It doesn't want to be squeezed between two elephants, the United States and China. As Charles Michel, the chairman of the European Council, has said, Europe prefers to be a player rather than a playing field in this systemic rivalry between the United States and China. Now, let me move on to the last slide, and that will be my final point. It's a table which I would call a dashboard. It's an attempt at presenting the key issues between the EU and China, and then speculate on likely developments in the next 4 years with Biden at the helm of the United States. In the area of the economy, trade and investment, it is likely that on the part of the EU there will be some diversification, but it's also likely that the EU will become more assertive in its negotiations with China. This relates to the fact that the EU and the United States are likely to have a much closer coordination on trade in high tech. At the same time, if you look at the column named Remarks, for Europeans, China will remain an attractive market. Let's see exactly how negotiations on the CAI or BIT will evolve. The second area, climate change, this is no doubt the most, where we could expect the most positive developments, because if the United States comes back to the negotiating table, there will be plenty of room for strategically important cooperation on a global scale, and China, of course, is a key stakeholder. Of course, at the same time, the EU expects China to demonstrate consistent implementation of all these climate-friendly policies, not just in China itself, but abroad along BRI routes. And ideally, the 2060 deadline will be brought forward. Perhaps there may be some sort of acceleration of this process towards China's carbon neutrality. But by and large, I'd say that the area of climate change remains the most positive, or will have the most positive prospects in EU-China relations. When it comes to balance of power, security and geopolitics, it looks like there will be a broadening of Western alliances, but at the same time, the EU will welcome China's contribution to certain hotspots, conflict resolution in certain hotspots. And the EU certainly does not want to see yet another Cold War. In fact, it remains committed to rules-based multilateralism. The last area, governance and systemic features, I think this is where one could expect the worst prospects of EU-China relations. It will remain an area of contention and growing tension, I would say. But at the same time, we have to say that this area of governance and systemic features remains part of the equation, which includes all the other broad areas. I don't think that it will dominate the entire agenda of EU-China relations. Let me stop at this, and I'll be very happy to take questions or, in fact, to listen to Professor Cui's comments on this. Thank you.